Hey minutes, welcome back. Falcon Knight's request after the last video on Sunless Fantasies sparked my imagination for this one. So far in the breaking of essentials, we've tackled societies that don't need to sleep, don't need sunlight, and this week we'll be exploring those that don't need air, specifically because they exist underwater. Underwater fantasies. Unlike with Sunless Fantasies, I've never written a story based in an underwater world, so I don't have ready-made examples I can draw on for this. So what I'm going to do instead is take you through how I would go about world building for this sort of society. The first step is to take a look at the other world building essentials and see which of them are affected by setting your story underwater and figuring out how to fix the issues created. The primary difficulty is the lack of air for breathing, for which there are three possible solutions. Either you give people a means of easily accessing air while underwater, like air tanks, or underwater air pockets, which could be really cool. Or you change their biology so they don't need oxygen at all, or you change their biology so that they can obtain oxygen in other ways, like how fish do. Once you've figured out that, the next thing you need to tackle is the heat situation. Underwater temperatures are around -2 degrees Celsius, which would be a major issue for any human trying to live down there. There are three ways you can also go about getting over this difficulty. Firstly, you can set the underwater location in a more warm environment. If you do, then think about how this affects the other flora and fauna around that have to survive in this warmer temperature than is perhaps normal. The second way you can get around this is by changing the human-like species from warm-blooded to cold-blooded. But if you do this, then remember that cold-blooded creatures tend not to consume as much food since they don't need to burn it for body heat, and they tend to be a little less active because they're cold-blooded. So the day-to-day life of your species will be a little bit different than any warm-blooded species underwater. Your third choice here is to keep your species warm-blooded, but help them retain the heat, like ocean mammals do. But to do this, you'll need to change their surface area to volume ratio. This is why walruses look the way they do, so that less heat escapes from their body. Or if you want to keep your underwater species looking a little bit more slender, then you'll need to consider other means of keeping the heat in. So if you're not going down the fur and blubber route, maybe some very clever clothing that helps them stay warm at such cold temperatures. The next world building essential you'll have to deal with is light, which may or may not be an issue depending on where you're setting your underwater society at in terms of depth. The sunlight zone reaches to about 200 meters deep, and beyond that is the twilight zone, then the midnight zone at 1,000 meters. After that you have the abyssal and hadal zones, but I doubt you'll be basing anything there. If you pick the sunlight zone, then you've got nothing to worry about. Light permeates into this level fine, so light and dark will follow the normal rules of our world. But if you go into the twilight zone, or any of those beneath, then you're going to have to think about some of the issues I flagged in the Sunless Fantasies video last time. Issues like, how do they tell time without the sunlight? I look forward to seeing what kind of strange underwater versions of Sakara Nights you come up with for this. Alright, next up, food. This should be fairly simple. There's plenty of food around in the underwater worlds. Consider factors like how any sea creatures that might be in regular contact with your people might be more like pets than food. You know, anything to add a little bit of flavour to your culture. Maybe there are some that you want to exempt from the dinner plate. You'll also need to consider things like, are there underwater farming systems, or is it more of a hunter-gatherer situation down there? Watch the video I did on food and fantasy and just apply that to an underwater setting and you should be good to go there. Next up, water. This can be a real issue because of the high salt content in the ocean. Sea creatures have evolved to deal with this through better osmoregulation, but that's all done through the kidneys, so it's not something that's really going to change the meat of your story. In fact, you're probably even not going to mention it because it's an internal body process. So it's not something that's going to change much about your story. I would just assume that if your species is able to obtain its oxygen from the water, then it's probably figured out a way of also getting water without too much salt from the water too. If, however, you've got a species that is reliant on air pockets or tanks or something and so actually needs a source of water down there, then you're going to have to come up with some creative solution for this, because they're probably not going to have a good enough system of osmoregulation to allow them to actually drink the ocean water. So how are you going to deal with this? Well, they need to get their fresh water from somewhere else. Perhaps there's a type of seaweed that they can obtain the water from. They can squeeze it out and drink it from there. Get creative and you'll find a solution for this one. But after eating and drinking comes, peeing and pooping. Now, most stories don't feature scenes of characters relieving themselves, which is fine. A lot of readers actually find that sort of thing to be a bit crass. I'm the kind of person who finds myself wondering what happens to the urine, because it can't follow the usual mechanics as it does when we go to the toilet. Anyway, I'll leave your imagination to finish off finding a solution to that kind of thing. Maybe you just have a society that is okay with this. The ocean is so big, dilution is possible. Finally, for the essentials, we need to consider how underwater settings affect sleep. Some underwater species don't sleep. If you take that route, refer back to the Sleepless Fantasies video for help with that one. But if you do have a species that sleeps, then where are they seeking their shelter? And how are they protecting themselves from predators while they're asleep? This is the kind of thing you're going to need to figure out, because otherwise it'll feel like a very unrealistic setting for your species. And there you have it, underwater fantasies. Already you can see how the variety could ensue just from setting a story there from the few things I've mentioned so far. So don't feel limited to go down the usual Merfolk route for this one. There is so much world building potential for it. Anyway, as always, happy creations, and I'll see you next time. Bye, my nerds.